Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to week 7. Can you believe we are in week 7, which means we're 1 week from completing this course? And so I want to say kudos to you. Those of you who have been taking this for a grade, kudos. You're doing great. I hope to have nearly everything that you've handed in to me thus far graded by perhaps midweek this week. For those of you not taking it for a grade, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been a tremendous journey, and I've learned a lot from you as we've walked together throughout this. So this week is going to be basically my final week of content. Next week I'm going to do one lecture that's going to rehash everything that we sort of talked about and try to bring it together into some form of systematic approach. And then next week also you're going to be uploading the video conversations, those 15-minute video conversations you're having with your group who has also read the same book that you have, because what we're going to do is we're going to be able to have exposure to a wide variety of literature on movements that I think is really helpful and really good for us. It'll be books that you may want to read at a later date that you don't have time to read right now, but I think it'll be helpful for us to get some summations of what some of the folks have read as they've navigated their group assignments together. This week, as we talk, I want to focus on one specific key component to navigating complex terrain that we are in, and to do so as a part of this missional movement we call the church. And it's a component that we reference, we'll name from time to time, but I don't know that we always pay enough adequate attention to the importance of it. And that concept is culture. The culture of an organization, the culture of our church, plays an immense role in whether or not we can faithfully execute and fulfill and implement the vision, the action, mission, and strategy that God has called our unique community of believers to. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, there's a couple great quotes on the front end. First is by the former Zappos CEO. He's actually featured in this book that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's called The Culture Code. And he says this words, and I love it. He says, if you get the culture right, most of the other stuff will take care of itself. And I think that points to how vital the culture of an organization is. My friend Dale Schaefer, who planted the church that I eventually ended up taking the lead pastor role of once he moved, who's now a district superintendent in Florida, he said to me as I was talking to him about Bridgeway Community Church, which when I inherited Bridgeway Community Church, it was really easy for me to sort of move in, hit the ground running. Now, there were a number of significant issues we had to negotiate. They had been without a lead pastor for 9 months. But there was this core stability within the context of the organization itself. And so when I was writing my dissertation, I called Dale and I did an interview with him, and I asked him, I said, what do you think created the stability of Bridgeway? It was a 9-year-old church plant that its founding pastor moved away, and oftentimes that means implosion. And what he said stuck with me. He says, I think it was the nature of our culture. And he makes the quote, he says, I understand that the most important work I could do was to architect the culture of the church. So I was able to hit the ground running because I inherited a meaningful, healthy, significant missional culture that I think was embedded in the very DNA of the organization itself. Another great quote here that you see is in terms of defining culture, because I think sometimes that's a difficult thing to do, and there's a number of different various definitions of culture, but I find this one to be particularly helpful. It says, culture is the deeper level of basic assumptions and beliefs that are shared by members of an organization that operate unconsciously, and I think that is a key term. Culture is what is operating unconsciously, shaping the actions, the attitudes, the words people speak, the way in which they see and perceive the world, and define a basic taken for granted fashion an organization's view of itself and its environment. And I think that's key for us. So when we talk about culture, I want to suggest to us that culture can be, if we're not careful, the unseen saboteur of our big dreams and great plans. Because culture very, very much is the water we swim in, right? It's the canvas, the backdrop against which our organization operates, in which the mission and the vision and the strategy is to be fulfilled. There's a great image there on the side of the PowerPoint, and it's of an iceberg, and it talks about how so little of what we do is above the water, right? It's our articulated visions and our strategies and our plans and our goals and all of those things. But unconsciously, right, under the water, often unseen, are the layers that oftentimes, operating in the background, that we're not even fully aware of, can wreak havoc on our capacity to fulfill the big visions and goals that God is calling us to. And I think many leaders and organizations have developed these great strategies only to be consistently undermined, and we're going to talk about these three words: toxic, competing, and contradictory cultures that exist in our organizations. Which means as leaders, we've got to learn to be able to take deep dives into the culture, and I would say this for churches, both the culture of our organization itself and then also the culture of the community that we find ourselves in. What we're going to discover there is sometimes the culture of the organization or the church is actually contradictory to the culture of the community it finds itself in. So there's an immediate disconnect between what we hope to be in a community and what the community is in itself, and how do we navigate that terrain between that disconnect. And I want to suggest to us that as we take a deep dive, what we begin to realize is that crisis and disruption, much of like what we've discussed as a part of this course, much of what gave birth to this course is the nature of the disruption that we find ourselves currently in, whether it's a COVID-like disruption or the disruption of post-Christianization or the disruptions that we've experienced in terms of the threats of scarcity and decline and all of those different elements. Crisis and disruption are often revelatory of the culture of an organization. Again, culture often operates in the background. It's the water we swim in until those waters are stirred up. What do you see when you look below the surface of the articulated vision and mission statements of your church, or just a shallow observation of what we see in our church? It's possible that many of us can come to church week in and week out and feel generally pretty good about what we see, but that's because there's not much at stake. It's just arriving every Sunday morning or just catering to the expectations of those who are there. We haven't tried to disturb the waters at all, so it can appear that things are healthier and more efficient and more effective and more significant for the kingdom of God than maybe they really are, which requires the capacity to take a deep dive. Where do you see a disconnect between what you long to be as an organization and what you really are? Being able to evaluate and name those disconnects. If you go down one more slide, you're going to see that culture is like the operating system that's always operating in the background of the organization. And it's learning to see, I think, beyond bad behavior. I have found that a lot of leaders, it's too easy when we identify an individual, an isolated individual or an isolated event that is what we would term bad behavior or not good for the organization, or we see somebody lash out or something happen that is inconsistent with who we want to be, and it's easy for us to name or label that as bad behavior or to get judgmental towards the person through which that happens. But if you start to see this emerge over time, say for instance every time you have a board meeting, you start to see bad behavior emerge, bubble to the surface. You have to ask the question, maybe this isn't just simply a moral breach. Maybe what is happening here is it's the manifestation of an unnamed culture that is existing in the background of the organization itself. Is there something within the culture or of the organization that produces a set of behaviors that are inconsistent with who we want to be as a church? Often there's an operational system that the taken for granted assumptions, attitudes, postures, and commitments that produce certain actions, attitudes, and words. And they're often unseen until challenged, disrupted, or threatened. And so, I'll give you an example. The first church that I was a part of, if you would have gone into that church on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night, you would have felt good about the world. Programs operated well. Things seemed to move pretty well. within the context of the church, you were even embraced and treated nicely. However, there was a shift being made in our church, which was beginning to create some bubbles to the surface. And what we began to realize is that even in the face of the shallow assessment of the good of the church, there was this unhealthy, contradictory culture that was operating in the background that was feeling threatened by the shifts we were trying to make as a church to be more faithful in reaching the community that we were called to reach, that began to manifest themselves in behaviors that were completely inconsistent with what you would have imagined to see on a Sunday morning or Wednesday night. But they were always there because they had been embedded in the culture of the organization for a long period of time, and they remained dormant until threatened. Toxic, competing, and contradictory culture can often confuse a leader. You can't get to where you want to lead people. Maybe you can't put your finger on the lack of engagement. Like you cast something compelling, and yet there's not a sense of movement towards that compelling vision. And you can't quite put your finger on why is that the case. You aren't sure where the latest outburst has come from, or you thought your vision plan, that thing that you'd been working really hard and putting together, would pass with ease, not only in the board but also in the congregation. But then all of a sudden, when you go to the vote, it just bubbles to the surface and everything comes loose. And what we have to realize is that's not just an isolated incident. It's probably the result of a contradictory or competing culture that is at work within, or a toxic culture that has been established over time based upon control, or based upon unconfessed sin, based upon wounds that have taken place within the congregational organizational life, based upon a controlling leader that might have damaged trust within the context of the organization itself. And so oftentimes we have to be able to identify that culture and begin to root that culture out in order to be able to make the shifts that we want to make missionally. Did you inherit a culture? Was there something already at work before you even arrived there? Have you been intentional in architecting a culture? We're going to talk about what that means to architect a culture. And do you know what there was supposed to be another word there on that PowerPoint. Do you know what the ethos of the organization should be if you're going to accomplish the vision that God has called you to? Many of us get a vision of what we see, and I think some of us brought this up in some of our discussions. We have no problem coming up with vision. We're just not sure how to get there. And part of that is we're not sure what kind of culture it's going to be required to get us to where we want to get in order to fulfill that vision. So that vision just remains a dream that's out there in the nowhere land that is never actualized because we're not sure of the steps in order to bring that vision to reality. So in the next lecture we're going to talk about the different forms of misalignment, and mismanagement of culture, and then we're going to talk about what can happen when we begin to intentionally reshape and architect a culture in a meaningful way.